Strelo with us as well, who teaches in our program. Our first distinguished guest is Basil Miranda, who is the Commissioner and Deputy Secretary of Regulatory Programs for the Bureau of Professional and Occupational Affairs, and Beth Miklovitz, Esquire, who is our Board Counsel. Each of them serves an important and specific position on the Pennsylvania State Board that license social workers, marriage and family therapists, and professional counselors. I have personally had the opportunity to work beside both Basil and Beth for the last 4 years as a board member and now as the board chair. I have learned much from each of them and how important this board is to serve and protect the people of Pennsylvania. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Commissioner Basil Miranda.
Good evening. How are you today? I'm told that LaSalle is the cream of the crop in the Big Five. Is that correct? And that Dr. Tonry is the best of the best here at LaSalle. I am the Commissioner for the Bureau of Professional and Occupational Affairs. I'm responsible for administrating the Commonwealth's 29 licensing boards. And I sit as a voting member on 27 of those boards. I'm a lawyer, don't hold that against me. And if you haven't already guessed, I come to Harrisburg and BPOA from Philadelphia. What we've done is put together a PowerPoint that kind of gives you an overview of what BPOA does, how the boards carry out their duties and functions. And we also included a discussion of certain types of disciplinary cases that the board deals with. So with that, I guess I'll start in with the PowerPoint presentation. My fellow board members hear me say this a lot, but when it comes to all these electronic gadgets, I consider myself roadkill on the information superhighway. So I ask you to be patient with me if I fumble through these presentations. Okay, first slide. BPOA can trace its roots, historical roots, back to William Penn. In 1681, William Penn established what was called a provincial council. That in turn evolved into the Department of State, which is the home department for the Bureau of Professional and Occupational Affairs. And as the slide indicates, its most current version was established in 1963, providing the administrative setting for all of the board, this Commonwealth's 29 licensing boards. Now, I administer the Commonwealth's 29 licensing boards, and as I explained, I sit as a voting member on 27 of those boards, so it kind of keeps me pretty busy throughout the week. One thing that provides me with a little notoriety as commissioner is the fact that I'm the guy that's responsible for signing all of the licenses that are issued by the Bureau of Professional and Occupational Affairs. So the next time you go to a hairstylist here in Pennsylvania, you can tell that person that I know the guy that signed your license. And the next time you go to a physician for a visit, you can tell him or her that you know the guy that signs his license and that you better do a good job. Pennsylvania is referred to as an umbrella board because all of the Commonwealth's 29 licensing boards come under one governmental agency. Most states have a separate governmental agency for each and every licensing board. In Pennsylvania, the legislature decided to take this umbrella approach and place all the boards under one governmental agency. That has worked out very well for us here in Pennsylvania. It's provided us economies of scale and interchange of staff. When one board's dealing with renewals, another board's staff that is not in renewals can help them out with their additional workload. So it's made for a lot of good productivity gains, and that has worked very well here in Pennsylvania. Now, the next slide gives you a list of all of the health-related boards that come under BPOA. And the one point I want to make about this slide is that there was one particular board, it was a glaring omission that never had continuing education until about 2 years ago. Does anyone know what that board is? Well, the one board, back.
Our board, social workers, marriage and family therapists, and professional counselors.
Well, no, it was even, it was one board that more recently enacted continuing ed, and that was the nurse board. You folks have had continuing ed for a few years now, right?
Yes.
The nurse board just enacted continuing ed 2 years ago, so that's the one point I want to make about that slide. It's a pretty glaring omission. Now, all of our health-related boards do have continuing education. And another point I want to make about this slide is that there's one board, the Occupational Therapy Board, that wants to go beyond continuing education into what is referred to as continuing competence. That is the trend nationwide in health-related boards, that a licensee will have to demonstrate their continuing competence every 2 years when they renew their license. And the Occupational Therapy Board is the first board in Pennsylvania to take that step. They're in the process of drafting a regulation that would require their licensees to compile a portfolio during the biennial period, during that 2-year period. And that if they get audited and have to show that they completed their continuing education, in this case continuing competence, they'd have to present their portfolio for the board to review. But you folks don't have to worry about that yet. The next slide is a list of all of our business-related boards. And on this slide, I can identify the 2 boards that I do not sit on. The first board is the Certified Real Estate Appraiser Board. I don't sit on that board. That board is an exception from all of our other boards. That was established by federal statute. And that was in response to the late 1980s, early 1990s savings and loan crisis. And the statute stated that if anyone's involved in the licensure of real estate agents and brokers, they are conflicted out from sitting on the Real Estate Appraiser Board. And because, as Commissioner, I sit on the Real Estate Commission, which licenses brokers and sales folks, I cannot sit on that board. The Secretary of the Commonwealth, which is the head of the Department of State, he sits on that board. The other board that I do not sit on is the last one, and that's the Navigation Commission. That's a very, very interesting board. I refer to the Navigation Commission as Pennsylvania's version of the old middle-aged guild. The Navigation Commission issues licenses to pilots that take the big cargo ships up Delaware River to the Port of Philadelphia. As you know, cargo ships come in from overseas, they come into the Delaware Bay. At that point, the captain has to relinquish control of the ship to the pilots who are licensed by the Navigation Commission, and they take the ship up to Delaware. Now, these folks, up until a few years ago, had to serve an unpaid apprenticeship program, just like the old middle-aged guilds. And it's a very limited number of licenses that are issued, about 150 or so, and it's like second and third generation licensees, grandfather, great-grandfather, grandfather, father, that type of thing. But don't feel sorry for these folks and their unpaid apprenticeship program, because when they are fully licensed, they stand to make anywhere from mid to high 6-figure incomes by being pilots. So maybe we chose the wrong profession. Now, the next slide indicates that BPOA has a twofold mission. First is to protect and maintain the integrity of the professions that we license. And we do that for the honest, hard-working professionals like your professors. And the second most important part of our mission is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of every consumer in the Commonwealth. And that is not some abstract concept. That includes my family, your family, my associates and your associates, your coworkers and my coworkers, my friends and your friends. So it's really serious business that the boards do at BPOA. And I can assure you that those boards carry out that duty with intelligence, vigor, and effectiveness. And we can get into some of the specifics of those functions. Now, how does the board carry out its mission and its function? Well, it's very simple. It does it through monthly meetings. This board meets on a monthly basis, and it meets 12 times a year, correct? There's some of our boards, the smaller boards, like the occupational therapy board, like the speech board, only meet like 6, 7 times a year. But this board meets 12 times a year.
Well, actually 10.
10 times a year.
January and August.
Right, 10 times a year. And all the business of the board is officially conducted at those board meetings. And usually the meetings are held in Harrisburg. We welcome you to come out to Harrisburg if you can find the time. But as commissioner, I instituted what I refer to as taking the boards on the road. And that is having board meetings at institutions where that particular profession is being taught. The idea there is to show the students what's going to be expected of them when they're out practicing and have their license. And that has worked very well. We've taken the pharmacy board to all the pharmacy schools in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, taken the nurse board to Philly, Jefferson, out to Pittsburgh. The medical board has been out to Pittsburgh. And in fact, this board has been to Pitt also, 1 or 2 times.
Once to Pittsburgh and then once to Drexel.
Drexel, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's worked very well. And it's all based on a very simple principle that was pounded into me when I became commissioner by Governor Rendell, who, as you know, is in Philadelphia. And he's a colorful character. And he said to me, pounding the table, I want you to make BPOA and its 29 licensing boards more accessible, responsive, and accountable to the legislature, to the licensees, in your case, our future licensees, and most importantly, the public that we're sworn to protect. So I've tried to institute that through, among other things, taking the boards on the road. So the next slide identifies the powers of the board. Boards have a lot of power. They have the power to affect you, the way you practice your profession. They have the power to affect the way you make a living. And like a district attorney, they have the power to subpoena witnesses to testify before the boards. And ultimately, they have the power to revoke a license if it's warranted based on a violation of the law. Now, the next slide gives you an overview of the composition of the social work board. Now, the social work board is made up of 3 different professions, and each profession is represented on the board. And each board at BPOA, including the social work board, also has a public member. 1, at least 2, maybe some boards have 3 or 4 public members. And the idea behind that is that the public member is going to come in with a public's point of view on issues that the board has to deal with. They're coming in with a clean slate, so to speak. They're not influenced by the profession. They're not captured by the associations. And they're going to bring in what is good from the point of view of the public and call it the way they see it, like a baseball umpire. And our public members do a pretty good job. They're dedicated, they're conscientious, they bring their own point of view to deliberations, and it helps make some very good decisions. Now, the next slide, of course, lists all of our board members. As you see, we try to strive for geographic diversity. And of course, under the statute, we have to have representatives from the different professions. And the one thing I want to state about our board members is that they have the distinct privilege to come to beautiful downtown Harrisburg to help make public policy for a grand total of $60 per meeting, plus expenses. That's right, $60 a meeting. If those folks were on the board of directors of some huge multinational corporation, of course, they would receive tens of thousands of dollars to attend board meetings, and I'm sure they'd be flown to some exotic island. So they're obviously not doing it for the money, they're doing it for the love of the profession and out of a sense of public service. So with that, I think they've earned a little round of applause. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our board chair, Connery, to speak to you about the duties of a board member. And you should take over again.
Actually, the commissioner kind of gave you a sense of what a board meeting is like, so I'd like to give you even more of a sense of what it's like. The board meetings run like a professional board meeting, and Robert's Rules of Order are used. We get a report from the prosecutorial division each board meeting, and typically they're going over cases. Oftentimes, a lot of the cases are CE credits that a licensee misrepresented on their on their renewal of their license. And then we have also, sometimes we have requests from licensees to meet with the board, and then we also have ethical charges that are brought and hearings that we have to oversee as board members. And in a sense, we sit as, it feels like the jury and then the judge. So we kind of are the jury when we listen to the case, and then we have to judge the case. The regulatory board reviews new and old regulations that are being questioned or changed. We review the budget. We determine when an increase is necessary for the licensing fee. Right now, our licensing fee is at $75, which is fairly inexpensive, and that's for 2 years. It was $45, but as just the expenses, and usually the expenses are prosecutorial expenses, grew, we had to raise it to $75, and it seems like there's probably going to be another increase before too long. We have an administrative person, Sandra Matter, and each of you may at some point have some contact with Sandra because you may have a question and call the office, or you might have a question when you're applying. And she is part of every board meeting, and she gives us a report and helps us review applications and correspondence. The commissioner gives a report, board counsel gives a report, I, as the chair, gives a report. The meetings tend to go from 3 hours and sometimes 2 days. We've had that a few times. The meetings are open to the public, and except for the executive session. And the positions on the state board are governor appointments. And any one of you may one day be sitting on this board. So as you get involved in the profession, you may find yourself one day being a board member. It is an incredibly rewarding experience. It's amazing how, when I first started, I thought that I was there to, in some way, protect the public, but I was thinking of the profession. And what I learned very quickly is we're always protecting the profession when you're protecting the public, but you're basically there to protect the public. And it really is an incredible experience. So the only way I would ever want to hear any of your names at the board is that you are going to be a board member. Okay, I will turn back to the commissioner.
Rhoda, would you want to add?
Not right now.
Okay, now, I'd like to flesh out some of the details and the background surrounding the functions of the board. What the boards do boil down to 3 basic functions. The first function is the rules and regulation function. Now, who can tell me what is a regulation and why you need a regulation? Extra credit. Well, it's very simple. When the legislature drafts a statute, a law, they draft that statute and law in general language. And the boards, our governmental agency, needs to enact a regulation to sort of put flesh on the bones, so to speak, of that law, to carry out that law, to give the citizens a little direction on what the legislature intended. Because the legislature drafts a statute in general language that can't control every possible scenario and situation. That's where the regulations come into play. And in the case of licensure boards, the licensure law, the licensure boards have the duty to draft regulations and enact those regulations. And the next slide kind of gives you a quick overview of what those regs address. They address the qualifications of supervisors. They implement qualifications for licensure. They promulgate regulation pertaining to standards of ethical conduct, and we're going to get into that in some later slides. And of course, most importantly, to promulgate and enforce the CE credit regulations. Now, where do these rules and regulations come from? Well, they're not pronouncements from on high. They are developed through a long, tedious process. This is probably the most frustrating part about being a board member. It takes anywhere from a year to 18 months to enact a regulation in Pennsylvania. All these different stakeholder groups have input into these regulations. The associations have input into the regulations. The public has input into the regulations. You, as a licensee, have input into the regulations. The governor's office has input into the regulations, as well as the House and the Senate. And there's one independent regulatory review commission, IRC, we refer to it. It can be irksome at times. They have a role in this process of producing and enacting a regulation. Now, the way I explain this process to our board members is that there's a method to the madness. The reason why you have this long, tedious process of a year to 18 months, the reason why you have all these different stakeholders and all these different groups weighing in on a regulation is because we want to produce and enact a regulation that makes sense in the day-to-day practice. What makes sense out there in your offices? What makes sense out there when you're interacting with a client? It's useless for us to sit up in Harrisburg and make these pronouncements from on high if they don't make sense in the day-to-day practice. The only way the board is going to understand and learn whether or not these regulations make sense is through this long, tedious regulatory review process whereby all kinds of different stakeholders have input into that final product. And hopefully that final product makes sense in the day-to-day practice. And I think that our board, the social work board, has been pretty good at drafting regulations that make sense in the day-to-day practice. So with that, I'll turn it back to the board chair and our board counsel. Now, I just want to make a point about board counsel. Each of our licensing boards has an attorney that serves as that board's counsel. And that attorney is the board's official legal counsel, and that's the attorney that provides the board with direction and guidance on regulations, on discipline, and other licensure matters. So with that,
Just next one for Bethany. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't know. So with that, I want to discuss, yeah, that's it. So maybe you can discuss the code of conduct.
Again, my name is Beth Michaelowitz, and I'm board counsel. And generally, the board has had in the past many regulation packages that are going through the system. As of now, we have one, and that is the Code of Ethics. And it's a long time coming. I don't know if you've been aware that we haven't had a regulation that would enforce ethical codes yet. But we've tried, and now we're finally at the step where we think we see an end in sight. We think that these regulations are probably going to be in effect by the end of the summer or early fall. And what they're going to do is, for each of the professions, the marriage and family therapists, the social workers, and the professional counselors, there's going to be a separate section that's going to say that the board recognizes the professional association standards as set forth in the community. So, for instance, the social workers are going to recognize the NASW Code of Ethics. The Professional Counselors is going to recognize the ACA, the American Counseling Association. And the Marriage and Family Therapy Code will recognize the AAMFT, Code of Ethics. That, in general, that's the way it's going to work. But then the board also recognized that there are certain parts of the codes that should be set forth in its own regulation, its own chapter, because these are codes that we're probably going to be using more than just some of the general ones. For instance, record keeping. We know that, I'll get to disciplinary actions that have come before the board, but one that we've seen a lot of is licensees that fail to keep adequate records. And we just don't feel that it's good enough just to say that you have to follow the record-keeping regulations set forth by the national associations. So for those kinds of codes, we've taken it out, we've put it in our own little, and you'll see it in the Green Book eventually. It's going to be a regulation. It's going to say basically that licensees are required to keep accurate records. It's going to set forth some other things about possibly how long the records have to be kept. Trying to think what else. There's also going to be in the Code of Ethics a statement about dual relationships and boundary violations, because again, that's something that the board has been seeing over time is a problem out there. We've seen that there's been disciplinary actions that have come before the board that are based on egregious boundary violations, and when I talk about disciplinary cases, we'll see that as well. So those are the kinds of things that we'll be looking forward to seeing in the Code of Ethics, and we're hoping that it'll get passed, and again, that we'll be able to enforce this pretty soon. Back to the Commissioner.
That is a very, those dual relationships? That's a very serious problem in both this board, social work, and psychology, and those boards take those type of allegations very seriously, because you have that, I guess they call it a power relationship, where the practitioner has immense power over the client and uses that power to take advantage in sexual and other personal types of situations, and that's why the boards are in existence, to address that type of conduct. So with that, as Beth mentioned, the board is doing a complete overhaul of our regs, looking at the Code of Ethics, things of that nature. And I'm going to suggest that some extra credit, that you take a look at our regs. I guess, can we get copies of the regs? Take a look at our regs and read them over, and maybe do a group project, and get back to Donna, get back to us with some suggestions on how to change and improve those regs. And read the reg from the point of view of someone like yourself that's just coming into the profession, and see if particular provisions make sense, and comment on whether or not certain provisions can be changed, certain provisions can be improved. I think it'd be a real worthwhile exercise, and maybe you can get some extra credit too. Sorry about that. Now, the next function of the board has is the actual issuance of a license. That is the actual piece of paper that I end up signing that permits you to practice your profession and, earn a living. And I've kind of identified a couple of questions for you to contemplate as we go through these next series of slides. What is a license? Why would you need a license? Is your degree enough? And how do you get a license? And for the most part, that administrative function, that licensure function, is carried out by our administrative staff. They issue these licenses to individuals who present their credentials to our administrative staff. They review the credentials, and they decide whether or not it complies with the law, and they decide whether or not you can sit for the exam and ultimately get licensed. Our board administrators and our staff are simply outstanding at BPOA. I often refer to our administrative staff as being on the front lines of government. They have to issue a license. They get a number of irate phone calls from licensees whose their licenses are in question or problematic. They get calls from consumers who believe that they are not treated fairly by a licensee. And those folks have to deal with those issues on a daily basis. They have to issue a license, for example. They can't, so to speak, pass the buck to another governmental agency. They can't establish the familiar refrain in the newspapers, a blue ribbon committee to study the issue. They have to address that issue then and there. So they're on the front lines of government, and they do an outstanding job. The board administrator for this board is Sandy Banner, and Donna and our board members interact with her on a regular basis, and she does a fantastic job. They know the law as well as me and lawyers sometimes, so they deserve a lot of credit. Now, I'd like you to hear from both Donna and Rhoda on the importance of licensure in your professional career.
Well, there's one thing I would like to say, and I was going to talk about the Practice Act that we're voting on. I'm just going to give that. Okay, you start, and then I'll finish.
Okay. I'm Rhoda Stradlow, and where I want to start is before there was licensing. And there are people in this room who know about that. Dr. Connery, Sue Morano, Dr. Smith, and myself. We worked for a very long time to get licensing for marriage and family therapists and professional counselors. Social workers were licensed a long time before we were. But licensing is important because the state is saying that you are qualified to do your job. And without that, anybody can call themselves, can practice, and that's where Donna's going to get to, as any kind of therapist or counselor as they want. So having a license says something. Having my LMFT, my licensed marriage and family therapist, is a very important thing for me because we work very hard to get it, and I hope that you will appreciate it and work as hard to get yours.
Just two things that I would like to add is, one, another way that the license is important. Of course, it's important because it's your credential, but it's also important for third-party payment. And you're not going to be able to accept a third-party payment out there as a professional, meaning from the insurance companies, if you're not licensed. And you may not be able to get jobs in agencies if you're not licensed. Obviously, you can get a job before you're licensed to get qualified to become licensed, but at some point, and especially if you want to go into private practice, your license is all the more important. The other thing that we're working on right now is the Practice Act, and that is, I think it went through the House, it has to go through the Senate. I think it's hitting some snags right now. But basically, the Practice Act is protecting the practice for each of you. And what that means is that right now we have what's called a Title Act. A Practice Act will make it that someone will not be able to call themselves a marriage and family therapist or a professional counselor unless they are licensed. Psychology does have a Practice Act now, and someone cannot be call themselves a psychologist unless they're licensed, if they're practicing clinically, and the same will be true for us. And who knows, hopefully this will go through smoothly, but there might be a point that we need people like you to help in the process of getting this through. But it really protects you in the future, and it protects the public. So for those two things, I think that it's being important for you to understand how valuable and important the license is. And I think that's probably about it for now. We'll have time for questions, and more things will come up when we get into the questions.
Don, maybe you can enlist them to contact their state senators to try to move that legislation.
That would be a very good thing. And being that it's coming from the commissioner, you know this makes a lot of sense. Call your state senators and say how important this Practice Act is for marriage and family therapists and professional counselors. And it's bill number 1250.
Is it House Bill 1250?
House Bill 1250.
HB 1250.
HB 1250.
So it passed the House, right?
It passed the House and it goes to the Senate. But, you know, Rhoda talked about the work that we have done. I remember in the early 90s seeing Dr. Smith sitting in front of senators making a case for us being licensed. The license didn't actually go through till December 98, and the first licensees didn't happen until 2002. This was a lot of work for a long time. And for you to just pick up the phone and call your senator, it really does mean something. If they hear from the constituents that this is important, and you're helping the state of Pennsylvania. This is really important for Pennsylvania. So I highly recommend that you call your state senator. House Bill 1250, this needs to be passed. Thank you for reminding me.
You know, God bless the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but it's not the most progressive state out there. And to really get things done, you have to push and cajole and argue and push people to act. So that's very important. And you can, you know, perhaps help yourself in the long run and help your profession and help you individually if you get this legislation passed. And believe me, the state senators and the state reps will listen to you, especially if you write them your own letter in your own words and make an argument why you think that particular legislation is important and needs to be enacted. They will take notice. So I urge you to do that, and maybe that'll be another extra credit project. Everybody's going to get A's if I
have to take courses.
Now, the next slide kind of gives you some stats on the number of licensees. Of course, the social workers and the clinical social workers that make up the biggest part of this particular board. There are 360 marriage and family therapist licenses issued in 2007, over 3,000 professional counselor licenses issued in 2007, and over 15,000 renewable licenses currently active under this board's jurisdiction. And the next slide gives you a little bit of information that could be helpful. Once you are licensed, the consumer, any individual in the state, can go online and verify whether or not you have a license, whether or not any discipline has been imposed upon you, and that is accessible to the public. And that is an important feature of our website. The public needs to know who is properly licensed. The public needs to know if a licensee has been disciplined. The public needs to know all of that information, and that's accessible through our website. And here, the next slide provides you with a list of all of our web addresses. So when you have some free time, take a look at our website. We're in the process of changing, I think they call it platforms. Anybody knows this electronic stuff. We're changing over to a different information platform. So I'd be anxious to get your comments. And if you go online and have problems navigating the website and it's not as user-friendly as you believe it should be, don't hesitate to get that information back to Donna or me. That's going to be helpful feedback that we can use to improve that website. So the website is the key in this electronic age to getting information out to you as licensees as well as the public, most importantly. Now, the third and most important function is the disciplinary function. And again, I set up this series of slides with a list of questions. What obligations do you have once you're licensed? What will be expected of you once you receive your license? What rights do you have as a licensee? And what should the consequences be if you violate law? And I want to set up some basic principles that are important for you to understand so that when Beth comes back, Donna comes back, and Rhoda comes back to discuss these specific disciplinary cases, it'll make a lot more sense to you. And let me start out by saying that the disciplinary function can be divided into two basic duties. It's the investigative function and the prosecutorial function. That's who decides what goes into the decision to investigate and discipline a licensee. And the other part of that, of course, is the adjudication function. Who judges that licensee? Who determines whether or not there's been a violation of the law? And there are two very important safeguards that you as a licensee have. And the first important safeguard is this Pennsylvania Linus decision. Linus was a physician in the Philadelphia suburbs who back in the late 80s, early 90s, a pretty hideous case, was sexually abusing his patients while they were under sedation. Information came to BPOA. An investigation against Dr. Linus was opened. Our prosecutors gathered evidence. Our prosecutors presented a case to a hearing examiner. Dr. Linus was represented by an attorney. That hearing examiner heard the evidence and decided that the Commonwealth met its burden of proof and imposed a 5-year suspension of Dr. Linus's license. That in turn went back to the board for the board's final adjudication. And that leads into the second most important safeguard. And that is, whenever a licensee is disciplined by a licensing board, that person is going to be adjudicated by a majority of the licensees, majority of their colleagues in that profession. But let me get back to Linus. Linus takes, the case against Linus goes before the medical board because he's a physician. The medical board decided that that 5-year revocation, that 5-year suspension was too lenient. They in turn imposed a permanent revocation of Dr. Linus's license. Dr. Linus got an attorney, a good attorney, who took an appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court reversed the medical board. And the key fact in that case was that 3 members of the medical board participated in the decision to investigate Linus, they participated in the decision to prosecute Linus, and they ultimately adjudicated Dr. Linus. And the Supreme Court said that was a no-no. That the decision-making process, the individuals that make the decisions whether to investigate a licensee, whether to prosecute a licensee, and ultimately adjudicate a licensee, had to be made by separate individuals. You can't mix those functions up, and the same folks can't be making the decision to investigate a licensee and then adjudicate that licensee. And the reason why the Supreme Court came to that conclusion was that in Pennsylvania, a license to practice a profession is a property right, subject to all of the due process safeguards in the Constitution. And if the same individuals participate in those decision-making processes, that is a violation of due process. Now, when I first got to Harrisburg, I was kind of put back by that Linus holding. I was a prosecutor, and I would look at a case, and not to be a Monday morning quarterback, but I would say I would have emphasized this piece of evidence, I would have had this witness testify, that piece of evidence wasn't strong enough, things along those lines. However, I made a 180-degree turnaround on this Linus case. And the way I made that 180-degree turnaround is on a visceral level. If my license to practice law is on the line, I would want all the safeguards that are offered by the Constitution if I had to go before the Attorney Disciplinary Board. And I think our board members have kind of come to that conclusion also. And the way I explained Line S was that in the Line S case, in prior to Line S, the board members were the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Now, because of Line S, the board members can only be the adjudicators, can only be the judges. And that has worked out pretty well with our board members. I think we've learned to work within those parameters, and we've been able to issue some very fair and just decisions, in my opinion. And that applies bureau-wide. Now, what are the consequences of disciplinary actions and overview of discipline? But first, before I get into the overview of discipline, I want to also emphasize the second most important safeguard that you as a licensee have. Now, first of all, you have this Line S decision that protects your due process rights. The second most important safeguard that you as a licensee have, in my opinion, is that you're going to be adjudicated by a majority of your colleagues in the profession. If you remember that slide that lists all of the different board members that serve on the social work board, and the slide that outlines the legal qualifications of who can serve on the board, well, if you go back, and I don't need to go back to that slide, but if you go back, you can see that the social work board in your situation is made up of a majority of professionals that know the profession, that know how you need to interact with patients and clients, and that know what is right and what is wrong as far as practicing your profession. So that goes a long way in providing you the necessary safeguards if, God forbid, you find your license on the line and you're subject to discipline. Now, I want to go through a quick overview of discipline and discuss and identify some basic principles. First of all, anyone can initiate a complaint. A colleague can file a complaint against yourself. One of your clients can file a complaint. If something comes up in the newspaper, our board members can clip that article out about the licensee, send it over to our prosecutors, and a case is opened up against that particular individual. As long as they don't have any specific information about that case, they can also participate in the adjudication of that licensee. Now, the Bureau of Enforcement Investigation conducts our investigations. We call that BEI. BEI is to BPOA what the FBI is to the Justice Department, what the local police are to the district attorney. They are the bureaus and the licensing board's investigative arm. They go out and do the gumshoe investigations of allegations against licensees. They gather information, they interview witnesses, they collect data and documents. Prosecutors function just like an assistant DA. They have prosecutorial discretion. If they have a case that comes in, they make the decision whether or not to go forward with an order to show cause, which is our charging indictment. An order to show cause is to BPOA what an indictment is to the U.S. Attorney, with a criminal complaint is to the district attorney. That's the charging document. And they make that decision, not the board members, not the commissioner. Why? Because of that Line S decision. They're the prosecutors, they're experienced, they have the expertise, they apply the law to the facts and decide whether or not the allegations in question merit in order to show cause. A hearing is held before a board hearing examiner, Now, the decision to delegate a case to a hearing examiner is made by the board. Most of our boards conduct their own hearings and have the licensee come in to a monthly meeting and present the case with their attorney, with our prosecutors, before the entire board. Other boards delegate those disciplinary hearings to hearing examiners, administrative law judges. I think it's kind of mixed for our board, for the social work. Do we?
Continuing education. The board hears all cases, most cases. The only cases that they delegate to a hearing examiner are cases where there's a lapsed license, somebody whose license has been expired, and they're practicing. The board doesn't feel like it needs to actually sit there and hear the case. A hearing examiner can do that. Same with continuing education violations. Most of the continuing education violations, there is a settlement between the parties, between the Commonwealth's prosecuting attorney and the licensee. So that comes before the board as a consent agreement. But in a few cases, there is a hearing involved, and those cases are delegated to a hearing examiner. Once the case is delegated to a hearing examiner for a proposed adjudication and order, it comes back to the board reviews it and makes sure that it is in fact the decision that they want to issue. That's how those cases work.
The burden of proof, of course, is on the Commonwealth, because the Commonwealth is trying to take away your license, your ability to practice your profession. Just like in a criminal court, the DA has the burden of proof because they want to take away your liberty. But the standard of proof in our cases involves a preponderance of the evidence. That is not as high as the standard of proof in a criminal case. The standard of proof in a criminal case is reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard of proof in our jurisprudence. And the reason why that we have that difference, that distinction, is we don't have the authority or the power to take away your liberty. But the DA does and can throw you in the jail if they convict you. So you're entitled to that higher burden of proof. The rules of evidence apply to all of our cases. When the board hears a case, Beth will be the presiding officer along with the chair, and Beth will rule on whether an objection is to be sustained or overruled. If the case is before a hearing examiner, of course the hearing examiner will do all that. Just like in those courtroom TV dramas, objections are heard, exceptions are made, and arguments are presented to the judge or the board hearing examiner to decide whether or not the evidence is appropriate. The hearing examiner issues what we refer to as a proposed adjudication. Why? Because the board has the final say. The board issues a final adjudication. The hearing examiner issues a proposed adjudication. Now, the board has the right to review that adjudication that's issued by the hearing examiner and reverse the hearing examiner. For example, if the hearing examiner decides that there's been a violation, the board can look at the transcript and decide that there has not been a violation, or vice versa. When a hearing examiner says there has not been a violation, the board can review the evidence and decide that there has been a violation of the law and can impose a penalty on the licensee. It all goes back to that very important safeguard that identified, the number 2 safeguard. That is, namely, that you will be adjudicated by a majority of the licensees, your colleagues in that profession. Now, if you're not satisfied with the adjudication issued by the board, you can have the right to appeal that to the Commonwealth Court, which is the intermediary level of review here in Pennsylvania. The next step, of course, is the Supreme Court. Now, our consent agreements are, I would describe our consent agreements as BPOA's version of a plea bargain in a criminal case. That's where the prosecutor gets together with the licensee and his attorney or her attorney, and they try to work out a settlement of the charges and the allegations that make up that case. And they come to an agreement on whether or not there's been a violation of the law and whether or not there should be some sort of discipline imposed. That consent agreement, again, has to come back and be accepted by the board. The board can reject that consent agreement. And just like in criminal court, a judge can reject a plea bargain if the judge and the board, in this case, in licensure cases, believes that the consent agreement is too lenient for whatever reason, or too harsh for whatever reason. Again, because of line S, the board can't interject itself into dictating the terms of that consent agreement, because that would be prejudging the case. They can only say whether or not it's too lenient, too harsh, and then it's up to the prosecutor and the licensee's attorney to work out the details and come back to the board with a more appropriate consent agreement. And we also have Act 48 cases, which is a expedited type of discipline case that amounts to the issuance of a citation, like a traffic ticket, to a licensee for a minor violation, a violation that involves allegations of whether or not a particular provision in the law has been violated or has not been violated. There's no room for mitigating circumstances. For example, we use that when a person fails to properly and timely renew their license. They either renewed the license on time or they didn't. There's really no room for mitigation. Or a person failed to complete the total, was it 30 hours of CE? Failed to complete the 30 hours of CE credits. They either did it or they didn't do it. And it's under the law, it's called strict liability. And it goes into this Act 48 citation program that it's an expedited disciplinary case. You don't have to have a big, elaborate hearing before the board. It goes before a hearing examiner. Of course, if you're not satisfied with that Act 48 adjudication by the hearing examiner, you can appeal that to the board. But those cases, for the most part, are handled through the Act 48 adjudications. And the consequences of all this is pretty severe. The board has the authority to impose fines of a maximum of $10,000 per count, and also the ability to impose a cost of investigation on licensees. They can reprimand a licensee, they can suspend the license and revoke it. And it goes on your record, and it remains on your record for your entire career. BPOA and our licensing boards